Welcome back to another episode of The Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week I'm joined by Rick, our team mental health counselor, to talk about the 5 losing strategies of relationships. I feel like this sounds so serious, and I'm very excited to dive into this. And Rick is also going to provide a bonus for the winning strategies. He was very pleased to tell me that. I'll give the bonus of the winning. Like, okay, thanks, I guess.
I can listen and be like, this is what I'm doing wrong, but what do I do
What do I do now? That is very true, right? There's like all the 5 losing. That's what I feel like. It's like the 5 losing strategies. Really, like it's just. I feel like it should be like an infomercial. But I'm excited. Let's dive into it.
Okay. So the 5 losing strategies and 5.
Like I kind of want to guess, but I don't want to.
Take a guess. What do you think?
I don't know. Now I'm put on the spot, and I got nervous.
We all know how you love to answer questions on your own podcast.
Lack of communication. Maybe that's one of them. Or is that too broad?
That's pretty broad. But don't worry about it. We'll get into it.
You're like, no, you lose.
I mean, lack of communication, of course, is a bad omen within a relationship, right? I mean, it's not going to help anything. But we'll talk about communication a little bit in this. So when we talk about losing strategies, this is Terry Real or Terrence Real. He's another relationship therapist, counselor. He's written books. I definitely would recommend some of his material. I think he's pretty good when it comes to identifying certain things. In particular, one of the things that, when I'm working with couples is understanding what some of the strategies are, because we can fall into these patterns, and some of the patterns can also be personality traits that we see in people. And so recognizing within yourself, if you do some of these things, that they can be harming the relationship. And all of these strategies eventually lead to just not necessarily breakups, but just very unhappy relationships.
He wrote, I don't want to talk about it, right? Is that who I'm thinking of? He wrote, I don't want to talk about it. Oh my God, isn't that the name of the book?
No, I'm trying to remember if he
it's
did.
like the, you know what
I don't want to talk about it. The book on male depression.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that's him.
I'm pretty sure.
Don't quote me. I can grab my phone and look real quick.
That's fine.
All right. So let's just get right into it. Losing strategies within a relationship. The first one is being right.
Oh.
Okay. So what is being right? It's an overwhelming need to be right all the time. We've all seen this. We've all heard this in couples and in people we know. There is a need.
And if you haven't, you're the one. Just saying. If you're like, I don't know anybody. No, it's you.
Right.
It's definitely you.
Well, sometimes we've seen couples that they argue incessantly, and the arguing is just about being right. It's like, I've got to prove my point. I'm right. You're wrong. I'm superior. That kind of thing.
I would never do that, so I can't really relate.
So in being right, this need is so strong that it kind of overrides all the other priorities of the relationship, right? When you sit down and you talk to somebody, when they're not arguing, when they're not in this space, you're like, what are the goals and priorities of the relationship? And they're like, oh, it's this, and build peace and like have a life together and a future and all these wonderful things. And it's kind of like, well, all that gets thrown out the window when there's an argument and they want to be right. And so the other person who is in the relationship, if you're always right, oftentimes what can happen is it leaves the other person feeling belittled and disrespected and completely undervalued in the relationship. And they really don't feel like the people that their partner values them or cares about their opinion or their feelings or their needs, because the only thing that seems to matter is this feeling of superiority and being right. And very often, being right doesn't actually change anything in the relationship. Okay. And if you've heard me talk about this before, go back to some of our managing conflict episodes. When I talk about there's 2 truths in a relationship, right? There's not your truth, my truth, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. There's your truth and there's my truth, and they're both equal. And so if you're always being right, you're ignoring and you're stomping on what my truth is. And you're basically saying that I don't matter.
And I would say that, correct me if I'm wrong, but probably the 2 most common responses to this for the partner, right? Like the other partner would be either just going to shut down and they're just going to be like, okay, and just completely disengage, disassociate. Or that makes the other person really on edge and wanting to also then be right for really no other reason than well, if you're going to attack me, then I'm going to fight back.
So
What would you say is more common, and is there a third
It depends,
option?
but like, again, this is where I feel like we're
Personality
getting into
traits?
a space where some of the material that we've talked about is starting to overlap. So we go back to Gottman, right? What are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? Complaining versus criticizing. Well, if we're arguing and I'm being right and I'm stomping on your opinions, the next horseman is defensiveness, and it starts to make you defensive and you start to argue back. And what happens as a result of 2 couples arguing? Underlying feelings of contempt set in. I get angry at you, you get angry at me, and guess what happens? We stonewall, which means we withdraw from the relationship, right? This is kind of like paint by numbers at a certain point, you know? It's like, well, it's not paint by numbers in the sense like once you're aware of what the dynamics are, well, now it's like it's not hard to see. It's hard to interrupt. It's hard to stop. It's hard to change. It's hard to communicate differently. It's hard to stop being right all the time. But, you know, people start arguing about whose view is more accurate, and it just kind of fuels this like self-righteousness, this self-righteous indignation within the relationship, and it does nothing to serve the relationship. And so sometimes it's like, you know, the simple question of, do you want to be right, or do you want to be in a relationship that works?
And this doesn't mean that you need to be like walked all over and never have an opinion or anything like that. But there's a big difference of like speaking and like having opinions and having thoughts and being open versus like, no, I'm right. And it comes more so from that like I'm winning and I'm going to crush you kind of mindset, right? Like at all costs, doesn't matter. Like I'm going to win, so to speak, this discussion. And it definitely takes a lot of reflection, because I feel like it's so easy, especially if you're someone who is just like gets keyed up by other people, to be like, well, I'm not just going to sit here and take this. You know, even if you don't really have the right position on something, you're just like, well, I'm going to be defensive now because you're coming at me. I'm not going to sit here. So I feel like it's just it is a losing strategy for sure. Big loser strategy. Biggest loser strategy.
And it becomes, honestly, it becomes exhausting, you know,
Yes.
even if you're not in a
On both
relationship.
ends.
Yeah. It's just, like you can look at a person who, you know, always thinks that they're right. And you're just like, how many times do you avoid the conversation with them?
You just don't even bring stuff up, because
don't.
it's like I'm walking on eggshells. This person isn't going to hear me, so there's no use. And that's so frustrating in a relationship, or even as a friendship. You're just like,
it becomes exhausting, and you just don't want to deal with it. And so the relationship ends up suffering. You don't feel as close to the person. You start pulling away and withdrawing, etc. So that's losing strategy number 1. Losing strategy number 2 is controlling your partner, right? Attempting to control your partner. Being controlling takes this kind of like a step further. A partner who becomes overly controlling when they try to perhaps change your behaviors, when they try to change your thoughts, when they try to make decisions for the relationship that match their own, right? This clearly starts to communicate to one partner that one partner doesn't trust their capabilities or the decisions, or have really strong faith in what the other person is capable of doing, because now I'm attempting to control everything that you're doing. Right? There's no autonomy left for you in the relationship. There's just me, what I want, and what we're going to do, because I'm going to control every aspect of it.
yeah, I've never seen that work well. Like never in any kind of relationship, I've never once seen that be like a winning strategy.
No. Now, I will say, again, there's a balance, right? Like if somebody is in a relationship and like, let's say like finances is something that people struggle with, right? But let's just say one person is like a financial planner, right? So they're definitely going to have more understanding of like the markets, options, things like that. But it doesn't mean that you make the decisions and give that other person no opinion. You say, all right, like you can sit down and you can be like, look, even though this is my field and I know what I want to do with our money, like here's why I want to do it. And here's why this option or these 3 options are better than these 2 options. Like, and this is why I want to put it in, you know, these investments or these strategies or whatever. And so if the other person's like, well, you know, my dad had put money in something like this and he lost everything when I was a kid. You want to be aware of those dynamics and you want to listen to what your partner is saying. And so sometimes it's like, okay, are there other options? Like maybe you were saying, let's put money in these 3. Can we do these 2 and then figure out a 3rd option? You know, that's something that I would feel more comfortable with. Like maybe these are aggressive and I'm more of a conservative person and I want like to feel like our money is kind of safe. It's like, okay, is there some compromise there? Yes. And if you're the expert, find another solution for it, right? So sometimes we can fall into these patterns where it's like, oh, well, it's money, so they deal with the money. Or it's, when it comes to parenting, they're doing all the parenting. And so you can kind of fall into these gaps. And so sometimes we have a tendency to stop talking and communicating with our partners, and we become way too controlling. We end up making decisions for the both of us rather than having like a partnership where we're both talking, we're both communicating. And it's up to me to be able to explain why maybe these strategies are better in whatever capacity we're talking about. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's not even just like overtly like, oh, I'm going to like make sure that you don't go here and that you only speak to these people, like the really, really extreme examples of control. And there's definitely a dynamic, like you said, like some people are just going to be better at certain things. Like that person's going to take the lead in certain areas of the relationship and then vice versa. Like that makes sense. And that's just kind of normal. But there is like that kind of slippery slope, right? To where it's like, oh, I'll just handle all this. And then it's like, maybe it's working for a while, but then a few years later, the person's like, I haven't been, included in this at all. And then it's like, well, I didn't think that you wanted to be or needed to be. And then, those kinds of things kind of bubble up after a while, even if they didn't seem like they were maybe a big deal. And that's where I guess that, communication and having someone involved in that like partnership makes sense.
Yeah. And
also the partner can be like, cool, I really don't care. Thank you for telling me, but like, I want you to continue to do this, right? And then if they're totally fine with that, then it's like, okay, that's not a controlling, because control is one-sided.
Exactly. I was going to say, if that's the case, if you're yielding control, if you're like, hey, do me a favor, you just take care of all this, great. Then it's not a control. It's like, okay, I'm stepping aside. I don't want to deal with this. That's you. So there's a difference in that. But controlling your partner can be both direct or indirect manipulation, depending on how you want to look at it. And no one really likes to be controlled, right? And so being aware of, if you're like that type A person who really likes to come in and make decisions, your behavior can be perceived as controlling, especially if you're not giving the opportunity for the other person to give feedback, if you're not talking to them, if you're not processing things as a couple, if you're not working together to create solutions together, right? You don't want to just be making decisions for the couple without that kind of communication. So here's the third one.
I'm on like the edge of my seat for these. Like, I'm not even kidding. I'm like, what are the 5 strategies?
You're thinking like which ones are
I feel
about
like it's like a game show. No, I'm just like so intrigued.
Okay, the third one. And this
God,
one,
I don't have that big of an ego, Rick. Jesus, I'm just curious.
You did roll your eyes at the first one, though. You were like, oh, God.
Oh, I mean, it's just kind of, it's funny.
Yeah. All right. So
it kind of lands, but not really.
The third one is what we call unbridled self-expression.
Unbridled.
Unbridled.
I love that word. I'm going to use this phrase now. Unbridled self-expression.
So what does it mean? It is kind of like this lack of restraint with one person's negative emotions. And they kind of just continuously project and display all of their emotions all the time. And they're just expressing themselves all the time in a very negative way. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay.
What would be like an example? Because I feel like I get it, but just in case.
Okay. Saying whatever on your mind all the time with absolutely no kindness or respect.
Okay. Yeah. I feel like a lot of people have experienced that.
The tendency also communicates the overall health of the relationship is constantly like susceptible to being upset, right? There's no real stability within the relationship. And it also shows that like the other person's feelings take a backseat, right? If I express myself all the time with absolute no regard for you or in any kind nature, like there's, you've heard people say like, with all due respect, like, and then they go on and they say their opinion, but they're at least trying to be somewhat respectful. I'm sorry, it's early, but they're trying to be clear.
Rick, you've been up for hours at this point. It's not, you can't use the early excuse.
It doesn't matter. I can't talk early in the morning.
This is how I get at night.
Strategy number 6, interrupting.
Yeah.
Call Terry Real, add a chapter to his book.
Here's an appendix that I wrote for you. Please put this in the second edition.
Yes.
So this would be maybe someone who is highly neurotic, right? Like a lot of negative emotion, a lot of volatility kind of in their emotion. And like you said, you're kind of now expected to like just, you're almost like dumping on people constantly, right? And that gets exhausting again in any kind of relationship, whether it's romantic or just kind of friendships. And, you know, everybody goes through different periods of time where like life is really hard, right? And so sometimes you have to give people a pass, right? Like I know there's been times where like I've been there for people where like I'm like, I know you're just going through it. So like every time we talk, it's probably going to be something crazy. And I know that I've also been that friend at some points, right? Because it's just like, oh my gosh, there's so much happening right now. And I just like, but I've realized it and I'm like, ooh, okay, like I was maybe acting in this way. And like, that's not always fair for that other person to always have to like hear that, you know, every time I'm around them or whatever. So there is a level of awareness here that I think is super important. Because sometimes we don't really realize that we're doing this or, you know, how that's making other people feel essentially. But unbridled self-expression. I just love this term, even though it's a negative thing.
Well, and to piggyback a little bit on what you're saying, I think there's a difference between recognizing when a person is in a situation, right? So there's situational times where these behaviors may present themselves, but we're talking about more or less a consistent pattern within the relationship, right? And you do have that where you're like, people will be talking in a room, right, about a topic, and then that person walks in, or you're within your relationship, and they just start blurting out their opinion. They don't care. And you're just like, oh my God.
Oh God,
right?
Here we go.
And so you end up avoiding and withdrawing. And if it can be the same way if it's your spouse or your husband or wife or whoever it is. It's just kind of like, I don't even want to talk because all that's going to happen is you're just going to step over me. You don't care about my feelings. And so it just becomes,
or you don't know
really
what they're going to say.
trait.
And then you're like, whoa, oh gosh. What's it going to be today? It might be nothing, but it could be a lot of something.
Yeah. And so what you begin to see is in these 5 losing strategies, sometimes they can very easily flow into each other, right? And so it's like when someone always has to be right, that leads into them wanting to control what the other person is doing. And controlling what the other person is doing also means you're expressing yourself in these really negative terms, and you have these kind of unrestrained displays of emotion that get to be too much for people. And these types of behaviors also indicate that that person's not really secure in establishing their own boundaries, let alone honoring the boundaries and partners of their partners and having limits on this stuff. You really want to be aware of what your own behaviors are. And some of this stuff can be very consistent with certain personalities. And so recognizing who you're in a relationship with is very important, because some of these things require insight, and some people just aren't going to have that insight into their own behaviors. And so, you know, like this can be very daunting for some couples to really overcome. And it can be difficult for people to be like, for just the first one, like, I'm right. And if I'm right, it's the better solution. How can I accept any other, like, why would I agree to doing something that's not as good? You see where that comes from? Right? And so it's like rationale and logic sometimes don't play a role in how to connect to a partner. And I would like people to really understand that concept, because when people start arguing, they get to this space of like logic and reason, and it doesn't work that way. That's not how you connect to people. Yeah? Okay. So the next strategy, the 4th one, is what we call retaliation. Okay. Now, what is retaliation? Retaliation is basically, like, how do I want to put this? When an emotionally unhealthy person experiences failed attempts at managing the relationship through such behavior, retaliation becomes the next obvious strategy. And this is where they start to hurt the person. They start to offend the victim's position. It can be overt, it can be passive, it can be done in a lot of different ways. And so this is where, you know, when we see the first 3 losing strategies picking up speed, or if they're not able to control or manipulate the relationship in those terms, this is where it starts to get to. And when you retaliate against your partner, whether that's putting them down or offending them or making them feel like they're the victim in the relationship, you're not helping the relationship. You're hurting that person. And you're, in fact, this is where real problems start to occur within the relationship. It starts to get torn down. It starts to, arguments and fights and emotional disconnection start to become a real big problem at this phase.
Yeah, that, again, I understand, but I want to maybe have like an example. And of course, it's probably going to, actually, let's edit that part. Well, I was thinking and it didn't come out right. Sorry, Danielle, this is a rough one. So that makes sense, but what is maybe an example that we could give everybody listening in terms of, because I feel like retaliation is a really like harsh word, which obviously this is a harsh situation, but outside of some maybe really abusive situations, like most people are not going to be doing things that are like super outlandish in terms of what we might think about in terms of retaliation. So like I guess maybe it's like an emotional retaliation tactic, like as an example.
So an example might be, I'm going to make you feel what I feel.
Okay.
Right? And so when you approach a situation like that, this isn't about understanding. This is about punishing you. And that's what I want to do.
Oh, that is so hard. Like anybody who's been in a tough situation like that, like in a relationship, you're like, I want you to know how I feel, like how you made me feel. But ultimately, that doesn't ever change anything.
There's a difference between...
I'm still not getting it.
No, you are.
Oh.
There's a difference between expressing to somebody through communication and saying, like, look, I would really love for you to understand what this made me feel, versus me making you feel what I felt, right? So now there's a difference between me trying to elicit some level of empathetic response from you by helping you understand how your actions made me feel, versus I'm going to make you feel what I felt.
Yeah.
Right? So this is kind of like two wrongs don't make a right here. So if I was wrong, it's up to me to start to express that, and it's up to the other person to be open enough to receiving it. And the fifth one is going to be withdrawal, right? And so obviously this is seen as shutting down and pulling away from the relationship. And so when we talk about, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which is, again, Gottman, we get to the fourth horseman. Well, what is that? Right? And so it's literally stonewalling. And stonewalling is shutting down, pulling away from the relationship, not communicating with each other. This is, taking time outs or reasonable distance. This comes from retaliation. Obviously, when a person's intentionally hurting you, you no longer want to be around them.
Yeah, I will definitely say that this is absolutely one of the hardest things that I've personally struggled with, because whenever I get like confronted with something, like especially repeatedly, I'm just like, okay.
Yeah.
And then I just shut down. And because I don't want to deal with it. Right. And especially like in a situation that maybe is more like highly elevated, unbridled self-expression. I love this. I'm so going to weave this into things. If it's a situation like that, then I'm just kind of like, And this goes for any kind of relationship. Like, I just don't want to deal with it. And I obviously know that that's not a good strategy. It's quite the losing strategy. But it's what feels comfortable to just like completely disengage. And I know that there's a lot of people who certainly feel that way. Because it's just like, I just would rather not confront this. And that's especially true when you're dealing with, like, if one person is the more confrontational person and then the other person is just like the more like,
sure.
What's the opposite?
Well, if you have one person who's a little bit more aggressive and the other person's a little bit more passive, right?
And that could just be like the constant, and that goes for any relationship. That goes for, family relationship. That goes for friendships. You kind of see that play out pretty commonly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are the winning strategies?
Those are the
Now I gotta know.
Let's go into some of the winning strategies. And so the first one is, and again, this is kind of, you start to see where some of the treatment and some of the different philosophies of different people overlap. The winning strategies are they say, shifting from complaints to requests. And if you remember from the Four Horsemen, they talk about changing criticisms to complaints. And so slightly different language, but so a complaint to a request is, to me, it's essentially saying the same thing, like stop judging the person and start making more requests to the person. So in this particular strategy, he says, learn how to speak and ask for what you want instead of taking what you want, or being controlling to get what you want, or, talking over the person. Like, express your needs appropriately. Make your requests specific. Make them behavioral if you need to, but also make them reasonable. Understand that, are you giving space and consideration for the other person? Okay. Step number 2 would be speak to repair with love and respect. Okay. And now this can be done a lot of different ways, but so some of the steps for, that Terrence Real kind of identifies in some of his stuff would be, contract with your partner to engage in a 10-minute dialogue or repair the conversation. We've done a podcast on, managing conflict, where we talk about repair strategies within arguments and discussions. Remind yourself that you love this person and that you're building a life together, right? We use these phrases a lot of times in relationships, and people talk about them and they're like, oh, I want to build a life with this person and I want to create these memories, up until it comes to a point where you're building it together. Or are you just having this person fit into your model? And so, there's like this thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So using the
Everybody
4 steps
journal about that.
of the feedback wheel, he calls it. What I saw, what I heard.
Feedback wheel. I don't like that.
Feedback wheel. 4 steps to it.
What is it, losing?
Well, this is what I saw, what I heard, what I made up about it, how I felt about it, and what I would like, right? And so a lot of times, one of the keys to understanding somebody is being able to repeat back to them in some paraphrased version of what they heard. Now, this can be done like through reflective listening or mirroring, and we can get into what those techniques are maybe at a different kind of podcast.
Yeah, that would be a really great
like
one. Like active listening kind of.
Yeah. And I always try and encourage people, and I've been on this kick more and more lately, is letting go of the outcome. Oftentimes we focus so much on the outcome and not the process and not the journey of getting there, that we lose sight of what the real goal is, which is to build the relationship. It's not to win. And I think sometimes people are just stuck in this space where I've got to be right, I've got to win, like I've got to feel superior. And oftentimes that comes from a space of insecurity and inadequacy within them, but they'll never admit that, because that would require insight, into their own actions. So, one of the other winning strategies, their third winning strategy, would be to listen with compassion. And this is what we talk about listening with empathy. This is being able to understand where your partner is coming from. This is why I tell people there's 2 truths in a relationship, your truth and their truth, and they're both equal. I don't care what you say. You can tell me like, no, they're stupid or they don't know anything, and that says more about you than it does them. Their truth matters. So the objective becomes listening to understand the person, not just to win. You don't have to agree.
I was going to say, like, the big part of listening and understanding someone or trying to understand their perspective does not necessarily mean that you have to agree. And I don't know, like, where the world got off track that everybody thinks that we all have to agree about everything. Mm-hmm. And this goes, again, for intimate relationships. This goes for family. This goes for friendships. This goes for society. Like, not everybody has to agree with everything. But being able to have a dialogue and be able to listen and be like, maybe I came into this with some, biases or presumptions, right? But I'm going to listen, right? We're going to have a conversation. I'm going to hopefully ask some questions, continue the dialogue, and then maybe we still leave and go, okay, that opened my eyes to this. Or maybe I still don't agree, but like, hey, we're cool. Like, it's okay. And I think that is so important. You can listen to people and still not agree with them.
Can you do it respectfully?
Yes.
And so one or two of the little tricks of this would be acknowledge what you can acknowledge, right? Usually we don't disagree on the whole thing.
No.
We usually disagree on 1 or 2 or smaller steps within this process. And then give whenever you can. Remind yourself, right? Like, this is the person that you're with. This is your home. This is your life. This is how you exist. This is not a person you're trying to conquer at work. Right.
And even then, hey, like,
this is the person that you like live with. So compromise is okay. It's okay to find a middle ground with the one person you've chosen to spend your life with. So find that middle ground, and acknowledge what you can when you can. So it's kind of like, okay, we can agree. We have these things in common. Great. What are the things that we disagree on? Now we can focus on just this part. Okay. Step number 4, empower each other. Acknowledge the gifts of other people and what they offer and what they bring to the table. Ask what you can do to help that other person and deliver what they're asking for. Sometimes the concession to be made is that you just maybe back down and allow this person to be right and take this in their direction. And what you'll oftentimes recognize is there's more than one way to get to point B, right? It's not always just your way, even if it is the most logical or reasonable or most efficient, or, it's kind of...
Oh yeah, and that speaks to so much of like what we do with like with coaching and consulting and counseling. Like yes, there probably is a faster way, right? You could be like, all right, I'm sitting across from a client being like, all right, if we were able to do these things in this time frame, it would make your life a lot easier. But maybe that's not where that client is at right now. Maybe that's not while it's our timeline, it might not be their timeline. And so I think that it's so important, like just in general, to like recognize that through any relationship that you're dealing with. Because we can often like have that, like our own thing that we think is the best.
Right.
Because it might be, like realistically it might be, but that person has to also be willing to do that. So that goes for any relationship. Yeah.
And 100%. The last step would be cherishing each other.
Oh, cute.
Right. There's the cute one. And so giving your partner specific positive feedback and appreciations daily. You guys have heard me say this. There should be a 5-to-1 positive to negative ratio within a relationship, right? That means, when you're having, for some of the people who, have worked with me or who have worked and understood the Gottman, I think I've even talked about it, and I don't remember if we've talked about it on podcasts, about State of the Union addresses and what that means. I guess we'll cover that in another one.
Yeah, that sounds also equally as interesting. So,
but
what are these names? State of the Union. Okay.
I've talked about being able to, part of the State of the Union address is sitting down and telling the person, couple should have like a weekly meeting, basically, kind of a State of the Union, like what's the status of our relationship. Okay. And in that process, you're going to sit down and you're going to talk about 4 or 5 things that the person did that were really great. Like, hey, this week, thank you for picking up the coffee, like on Tuesday. You made the bed this morning.
Thanks, Rick.
I appreciate them.
My coffee.
Yeah.
You really just wanted a little confidence. Like, cherish me.
Whatever it was that you did for the other person that went totally unrecognized. This is your spot to recognize and appreciate that individual in your life and what they do. Getting up early and making changes to their schedule, whatever.
Wow.
But hey, nourishing the relationship, paying attention to the things that they do, and building on strengths. And I feel like when couples argue a lot, what ends up happening is they're arguing and they get to a space where they finally stop arguing. And so what happens is the presence or the absence of difficult times becomes the standard for a good relationship. And it's like, no, like just because we're not arguing doesn't mean that this is as good as it gets. Like I want to build in a space that is positive. And so again, if we're going back to that emotional bank account for the relationship, like every good thing that we do, everything that we recognize, little love notes, little massages, little touches, little quality time, whatever it is, you're investing back into the relationship. And so what ends up happening when there is an argument, when there is a big deal, you have money in your account to take out and pay for that negative thing without going to zero. And you just keep building the relationship from a positive perspective rather than just like the absence of chaos is good, right?
Yeah, that's better than being in the depths of the chaos, but we can get a little better than that. Let's set our sights higher than that.
Pay attention to these, these strategies, you guys, if this is you in a relationship, like if you're, if being right and unbridled self-expression and retaliation, all lead to withdrawal, all lead to hurting the relationship and ultimately lead to separations and divorce or breakups. So hopefully you guys can, these at least start opening doors and conversations and dialogue to have with your partner. Again, some of these can be very personality specific. And so you just really want to be, persistent and patient with each other.
Yeah, this is definitely one of our podcasts, like the last one we recorded on impulse control. That's something that you can apply like immediately. And of course, depending on what the impulse is, there's going to be a longer time frame. But generally speaking, like that's like a pretty quick one. This kind of stuff is going to take a while to unpack, right? Because you might be hearing this and might not even be really aware of how you are even acting in these ways, right? Like that takes a lot of just introspection and like time and reflection. So like this is something, if you're listening, for yourself or for your partner or whatever it might be, like these are going to take some time to work through.
Yeah.
This is not going to be like a
quick fix,
which none of the stuff we talked about, but some things are much faster to implement, like change your environment. Okay. Can do that right away. And for something like this, that could certainly be a part of it, but it's going to take a lot of just unearthing to figure out like what is even happening, I guess, first. How am I even doing this? How am I even acting? And that's a big process.
Well, yeah, like when we talk about the stages of change, right? Like and the stages are like pre-contemplation, contemplation, etc. The very first stage of change is if the person's stuck in a space of denial, right? Essentially. And so with this, if a person can read these things or hear these things and recognize, yes, this is me, like they're out of that first stage. But if they're like, no, that's not me, like we're stuck in that very first stage of denial. So getting somebody out of that stage is, you can't produce any change if a person's unwilling to recognize that a problem exists. So the first idea is to get somebody to recognize that a problem exists. And these are slightly bigger problems in a relationship. But if you're like, oh, I've been in multiple relationships, I've never changed anything, and I'm hearing the same things over and over again, and you possess just enough insight to be honest with yourself, then there's hope for you. And
Absolutely.
Hope for the relationship.
Yes. So for more information actually on consulting that people could work with you, this is obviously something that would be really, we'll edit that. I'm like, the thing is dying and I'm very nervous. Oh, I get nervous.
Say it now.
I know. Okay. So for more information to work with you, how can they contact you?
Email, fullcircletherapyfl@gmail.com.
And for all information on our coaching services and our app, you can visit teamlocofit.com. And if you guys enjoyed this episode, please share it. That is the best way that we can grow the show and get the information out there. So thank you guys so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.